This video is going to show how hotkeys work in RetroArch. I'm using this in a RetroPie installation on a Raspberry Pi, but the same principle should work for most RetroArch installations. So hotkeys, well, first if we log into my Raspberry Pi or whatever your installation is, you can see the IP address I've got at the top. That's just what I've used in PuTTY to connect. My other videos will show how PuTTY connects to the Raspberry Pi, but for the moment, if I log on as user Pi and the default password of Raspberry, you can see there when it boots in the red text, you've just remind you what the IP is, and you'll see that on the TV if you're not doing this on a sort of network basis. Most of this can be done without that anyway, so it's just a case of setting up hotkeys. Now hotkeys in RetroArch are essentially shortcut keys. They're a way of pressing a single key on the keyboard to get to a step that would take several steps through the GUI interface, which RetroArch has. So when you're playing a game, you can press F1, which is in itself a shortcut hotkey, to bring up the menu, and you can do most of the functions there, but it's obviously quicker and easier to use a single key. So for example, F2 saves a game, F4 loads a game, P pauses a game, and I think X resets a game. So there's lots of, and obviously escape will escape out of the game entirely back to the interface you're in previously, which is often EmulationStation on RetroPie installation. So there's lots of useful shortcut keys, or hotkeys as they're called here, to jump back and forth between different functions in the game. And it's a lot easier than using the menu where you can do that. So a very popular step to use hotkeys in particularly a RetroPie, Raspberry Pi environment is to map hotkeys to joypad buttons, because otherwise you've got to have a keyboard plugged in all the time, and it's a lot more portable and a lot easier if you don't have to worry about having a keyboard involved at all. You can still have a keyboard in as well if you need to, but a lot of the advantage of mapping hotkeys to joypads is the portability of it, the ease of use. You can just press a couple of buttons on the joypad and save a game, or restart a game, or quit out of the game. It's much easier. So hotkeys can have 3 steps, and hotkeys, again, just a reminder, they're things like saving a game, loading a game, quit out of a game. And all of the hotkeys can either be enabled all the time, so that would be if I was to press F2, it will just save a game, F4 will just load a game, and that's the case with all the hotkey buttons. You can just say whenever I press it, it's going to work, which is fine, but if you use a keyboard for other things in the emulator, the hotkeys could get in the way because they'll always be active. So that's one state, enabled. Another state for hotkeys is completely disabled. You can disable them in the config file, so when you press F2 nothing happens, F4 nothing happens, any hotkey button nothing happens, which could be useful if you're using the keyboard in-game for controls and you just don't want the hotkeys to kick in at all, so you can completely disable them. But the third option for hotkeys is that they only work when you activate them, which is to say that F2, for example, will only do its hotkey function when you enable hotkeys by pressing another button. So I might map, I don't know, the letter U to enable hotkeys. So if I hold down U and then press F2, then F2 will have its function. And by and large, that isn't that useful on the keyboard necessarily, other than stopping you hitting a key accidentally or something, but it's really, really useful on a joypad. For example, if you've got a joypad and you want to say, when I press the X button, I want to quit out of the game, by pressing X, that in the game might be a jump or sheep button, and you can't just press that and quit out of the game because it would make it unusable. You wouldn't be able to use the in-game controls properly. So enabling hotkeys when you want is really useful. So for example, you can say when I hold down select and then press X, it quits out of the game, or hold down select and press A, it saves the game, or hold down select, press start, it exits out of the emulation altogether. So that third state of only running hotkeys when you're pressing another button is probably the most popular. Now in the RetroPie installation script, they have updated it to automatically set these hotkey states, either enabled, disabled, or only when you press a button, automatically, so you don't have to edit a config file at all. And we'll take a look at those. Just checking some details here before we go into that, make sure I've covered what I wanted to do there. yeah, essentially it's when you're trying to map hotkeys to joypad buttons, which is where most people would want to do it on a RetroPie installation. It's important that they aren't enabled all the time because, like I said, if you press A, you want A to do the jump or shoot in-game function. You don't want it to kick in with a save game function without specifically being told to. And disabling them altogether wouldn't do anything for you because you would never get to work with a joypad keyboard or anything. So you really want to go for that third option where you enable them. And the option in the retroarch.cfg file is called input enable hotkey button, and that's the one really that does all this triggering, and we'll have a look at the config files in a second. So first thing, looking at the script that RetroPie has, back to the window. So I've been going on for 5 minutes and not done anything, probably not the most riveting video in the world, but if we go to this directory, if you go cd space, now those of you who are a bit more familiar with this terminal interface, you'll see what I'm doing and you can go around it your own way and do this a bit differently. But if you're following it literally step for step in the command prompt here, if you change directory to home pi retropie setup and press enter, it goes into that directory. After I change into a directory, I tend to list it just for the sake of it. You don't have to, but it's just useful to see that there's files in there, and that's what we've got options to do. The blue colour means it's a folder, and the green one means it's a executable script, something to run. White tends to mean it's sort of a text file that you can just read. Red, I think, is an archive, and there's a few other colours, but it won't usually matter. But blue's useful to know because it's a folder that you can change into. Okay, now the script, the setup script there is retropie_setup, which is this one here, and to run it as administrator sudo, and you prefix it with // to execute this, and it's retro, and the case is sensitive, so you must type it exactly. Tab helps sometimes because if there's a unique element you can just press tab and it auto completes for you. retropie_setup.sh. Okay, then press enter and it will run that setup script. Now I probably won't, this is just briefly complaining I haven't got a lot of space on my SD card, but I'm not going to worry about that. You probably won't get that message. I'm going to run it anyway. Okay, that's what you will get. You'll get the script coming up, and I'm going to go into the setup option. Now, depending on the version of the script, whether you've updated it or not, it might look marginally different to this, but look for the setup, select that, and you can see down here under my option of 310, it's change hotkey behavior. So you can change the hotkey function into one of those three states that I spoke about earlier. Enabled, so they always work all the time when you press them. P pauses, X resets, F2 saves game. Or disabled, so they never work, or set it to only work when you're holding down the enable hotkey function. So if I enter that, there's the three choices. Enabled, which is default, so by default if you don't change anything on a recent installation, they will just work when you press them. None of the joypad keys will work as a hotkey button because by default that's an extra step that we can have a look at in a minute, but in terms of the keyboard they will all be enabled. Or be disabled, which is option 3, which means to do any of the more advanced functions like save and load games, you'd have to do it through the GUI menu, and in the hotkeys disabled, that's done by pressing escape, and that would bring up the menu for you to sort of go further. And the second one is really the one that's going to be most useful. Press, in this case, Alt, but it could be any button to enable hotkeys. In this menu, in the RetroPie setup, it uses Alt is the one that it is set, and we can take a look at that in a minute. And so if we hold down Alt, press F2, it'll have its function, or any hotkey, it'll have its function. I'm just using F2 as an example of a hotkey, but obviously any hotkey will be used there. Okay, so if you choose press 2, press Alt to enable hotkeys, or if you choose any of these, it will write its changes back to the main retroarch dot cfg file. And what we'll do now is look at how this script works. So I'm going to cancel out of that, and cancel out of that, and cancel out of that. Now we're going to have a quick look at that script that we just run, and it's in this particular path here. If you type on the screen change directory
and this is the path you want: /home /pi /retropie -setup /script modules / supplementary. Now, depending on the version of RetroPie that you've got, this script may or may not be there yet. So if it's not there, it's just that you've got a slightly older version. You could update it, but you don't have to, because it can all be done manually. It's just a quick way of enabling, disabling, or doing it on demand with the Alt key. So I'm going to change into that directory. There's a set of scripts here, and we're just going to have a look at the Hotkey one, which is the script behind that screen we saw a moment ago. So I'm going to go sudo to run it as administrator, nano, which is the text editor, and the one I want to look at is called Hotkey.sh, which is the script. If I open that up, you can see this is what it's doing behind the scenes. Now, on this line here, we've got three options, which is what we saw: hotkeys enabled. Option 2, press Alt to enable hotkeys, and option 3, hotkeys disabled. I'll have a go at running through these options to explain how they work. Most of them are fairly obvious. So, three options, and here are how it changes the retroarch.cfg file. And you can see whichever option is chosen, they all alter in the opt/retropie directory, which is the root there. Then it goes into the configs directory and the all directory and the retroarch.cfg folder. So when you make these changes, they all alter this file for you, retroarch.cfg, the main config file. And pretty much any game that you play in RetroPie through EmulationStation will run that retroarch.cfg file. So settings there take effect for most of the systems. Systems that won't read this are by default ones like MAME, the Spectrum ones, C64, FBA. If you run that won't look at this, but the majority do, like NES, SNES, Mega Drive, Master System. I think even the Atari ones, quite a few. The majority will use RetroArch, and that's what we're looking at. Okay, so the first option, which is hotkeys enabled, which means that they work without having to press anything else, it makes three changes, and all of these options make three changes to that file, and they make changes to the input enable hotkey button, and that is the one that you have to press to activate hotkeys. The second option is that it changes is input exit emulator, exit emulator, which is the option to take, not just restart the game, but to quit the whole emulation and go back to your previous state, which would usually be EmulationStation. So that's the one to get back to your main menu to choose another game. And the third option is input menu toggle, and that menu toggle is the internal RetroArch GUI menu, so you get all of the options coming up in a GUI there. So the first option, where hotkeys are enabled, it says that to enable hotkeys it's null, which is nothing. So the value in the retroarch CFG file for input enable hotkey, it would say equals and then just nothing, a space, to say that you don't have to enable hotkeys. It's empty, so they all work. So on that basis, pressing the escape key will kick in this hotkey of input exit emulator. You don't have to do anything else, you just press escape and it will quit out. And that's the same for all the other hotkeys, like save game, load game, reset, next shader, previous shader, any of them. And the third option there, input menu toggle F1. So if I went for this hotkeys enabled, it would put these settings in, and if I pressed escape, it would exit the emulator. If I pressed F1, it would bring up the main menu, and it's as simple as that. That would just work. But again, that's a problem if you're trying to map these to a joypad, because when you press a particular button, you want it to have the in-game function. You don't want it to automatically escape your emulator. And that's quite often the reason why on forums people say, I've got my hotkeys mapped to joypad, I press a button and it's just quitting. It's because the hotkeys are enabled. What you need is to use this input enable hotkey button. So you can see that on the second option, press Alt to enable hotkeys. We've got a value in input enable hotkey as the Alt key. So none of the hotkeys will do anything unless you're holding down Alt first. So whilst these two values are the same, input exit emulator, escape, and input menu toggle F1, they're the same as the option above. They'll only work if you're holding down the Alt key. So it makes the keyboard a bit safer to use. You're not going to accidentally use a hotkey function because you've got to hold down the Alt key for that to kick in. So
that is effectively the option we'd use with mapping options to joypads as well. And the third option here on the script that automatically sets these for you is disable them. And you can see that here, input enable hotkey. For hotkeys to be enabled, it's the escape button, but the escape button also brings up the menu. So by pressing escape, it will bring up a menu, and you can't press any other hotkey because you need the escape key to run it, if you see what I mean. So you'd have to hold down escape and then press the hotkey, but that won't work really anyway because escape will kick in the menu. So it's very much a disable hotkey option, as it says there, and as it says at the top, press escape to open the GUI. And the exit emulator also has a null option, so you can't get out of the game in that manner either. I don't know why you'd want to do that. That sort of basically disables all the hotkeys, and you can't exit the emulator without using the menu. So you'd press escape, the menu would come up, and you'd use the menu to quit the emulator. So maybe there's situations in a sort of kiosk mode where you'd want to run that, it might suit you. But I think most people who are using joypads will want to use the option 2, which is where you optionally activate the hotkeys by pressing down a key first. And these are the values, or mainly this first one, input enable hotkey. These are the values that you want to look at in your retroarch.cfg file to see what it's set to. If it says equals and then nothing, you know that all the hotkeys are just working straight off the bat. But if you see it's got a value like alt, you know they're only going to work if you're holding down a key. And with this, and what we'll look at in a minute with joypads, is we can set input underscore enable underscore hotkey underscore btn, which is short for button, and set a button on the joypad to be that sort of that trigger to allow hotkeys to work. And that's the important element there. So that's just looking at the script and how that does it automatically for you in RetroArch to kick in with the keyboard options, but it won't do anything for your joypad. Okay, so I'm going to quit out of that with holding down Control, hit X, and because I haven't made any changes, it goes straight there. If you have accidentally pressed a button, it'll say, do you want to make a change? You just say no, and then it should quit out without a problem. And now we're going to have a quick look at that main retroarch.cfg file. And to get there, just copying this out of the document, you can change directory again, and you go to apt/retropie. Just checking that. Do we want to check that first? This is going to have a look at the joypad auto-generated file first. So if you're using the auto-generated script, which most of you will, and you'll see this in my other videos, how to create a joypad script automatically without having to sort of manually type it. The system will create this document, this file for you, and this is in the CD directory, change directory into apt retropie emulators retroarch configs. So if I change into that directory, and particularly in this directory, it's useful to do a command of list, but showing some date in there as well, -lah. We'll just show this in a sort of view where you can see what's going on. And you can see in my example, the only file that I've edited since I've installed RetroPie 2.3 is the 1 second from bottom, December 20th date, and it's got my USB controller saved in there. So you can use that command to see which ones have been changed and which ones you're likely to be using. And then when you're in there, you can edit it. So what we're going to do is have a look at this file with sudo going to run it as administrator if I want to make changes. Nano is a text editor, and I know it begins USB in capital letters, and to save me typing the rest, I'm just going to press tab, and you get the file name appearing. Press enter. It's a fairly short file. Now when it's automatically generated, all of the files from this point at the top down to there are automatically put in, and they get imported into the main file, which we'll look at in a minute. So this file gets pulled into the main file, if you like. When you start a game, the main retroarch.cfg file will read this file if this joypad's plugged in, and that's the advantage of the hot detection. You can just put a joypad in, it detect it, and then all the buttons in there, including any that you've amended to sort of be specific to that joypad will get pulled in. So in a lot of cases it's better to use your button controls in an auto-generated file rather than hard-coding them into the main retroarch.cfg file, which you can do, but it's just often a bit more dynamic and easier if you use it in these auto files. So this file was created up to this point here, and everything below that I've typed in and added myself. And the key one, you can see that we were talking about earlier, is input enable hotkey, and I put underscore btn because it relates to a button on my joypad. And I've put equals 6 in brackets, and you can quotes, and you can see above 6 is my select button. So I've basically said to the system that hotkeys are only going to be enabled when I hold down select. Without that, they're not going to kick in at all. So I've then put a series of other hotkeys that I want to use. So I've said to exit the emulator to get back to the, on my joypad, to get back to the EmulationStation, press 7, which you can see above is my start button. So holding down to select, tap start, and it'll exit. Another one there, I've got scroll through shaders, so 5 and 4, which are here, my left and right buttons. So they're the sort of top paddle buttons on a SNES style controller. What else have I got? I've got save a game with button 3, which is my Y. So if I hold down select, press Y, it'll save the game as a save state. There's a separate video on saving games so you can see how they work. And then another one is loading games. So you quickly flip between loading and saving games. One is my B button, so I can load a game with the B button if I'm holding down select. And the last one I've got is reset, which is just go back to the title screen of the game, so not quitting the game entirely, just quitting back to the main screen of the game you're playing. 2, which is the X button. So select and tap X and I reset the game. And that's the easiest way of doing it, just specifying it in the file of the joypad you're using, because obviously different joypads have different keyboard mapping buttons, so to hard code it in the main retroarch.cfg file can be cause a few problems if you're using different joypads, and it can just get a bit confused. So I think it's easiest and simplest to keep it in these imported files here, the automatically generated files that are imported here. So that's where you want to set this. You want to put to make joypads usable in terms of hotkeys and get them to use hotkeys, put it in this file, enable a hotkey button, because without this line you'll end up just, if I press the start button, it would just use start to reset the game, and I wouldn't be able to pause the game, which is usually what the start button does in a game. So this is very important to have an enable hotkey button to only enable hotkeys when I'm pressing whatever I've set here. Okay, so that is where it all pulls those files from, and we'll look at the main file now. We'll look at the retroarch.cfg file that does all this work. And if I go to, I'll just change to the directory where it lives, which is /opt/retropie/configs/all. But before I do that, actually, I'll just go to cd.apt/retropie/configs, and if I list that directory, you can just see, although there's an all directory where the main config file is, you've got all your system directories as well. And the majority of these, the way EmulationStation works, it will import the main retroarch.cfg file, and then if you've got another retroarch.cfg in a system specific folder, it will apply that in the same way that it pulls in the controller config. It will pull in the retroarch.cfg in the system specific. So if you just want a particular shader for a particular system, it will pull that in from this file. So if I put something in the retroarch.cfg file that's in the Mega Drive directory, and it contained a line that was also in the all directory, the Mega Drive element would overwrite it. So it's whatever is in these files will override the main ones. But by and large, most of the instructions will be in the main document. You'd only want some small instructions to specific systems like shaders. I'm not sure what else you would put as a system specific only. Maybe you would hard code some controller that you only want to work with a particular system, so you could put that in there as well. But by and large you don't need it. So if we cd to all directory, and you can see in there there's a retroarch.cfg file, retroarch.cfg. This is the main file that
does all the imports. It's quite large. Okay, so I tried to change into a file. That's not going to work. You can't go into a file like that. I want to edit it. So it's sudo nano retroarch.cfg, like that. And it opens up the file that gets processed. As I said, this one's quite large. What we'll show here are a few options where it deals with hotkeys and also where it pulls in that automatic controller file. So I'm just going to skip to a section where in a file you can jump around and search with text with holding down control and hit W, and you can see at the bottom it says search. I want to look for where the auto detection is. So this is quite useful to understand what it's pulling in. Auto-detection, press enter, and it jumps down. You've got the cursor there. Enable input auto detection will attempt to auto configure Joypad to plug and play style. So you can see it, I haven't got a hash at the start there, so it is using this line, and it's saying it is trying to auto detect. True. And so it's looking for those files that have been auto generated, and it will say, is that Joypad plugged in? And if we scroll down to here, you can see the directory for that Joypad auto configs PC. If a Joypad is plugged in, that Joypad will be auto configured if a config file corresponding to that Joypad is present. So we saw earlier mine was USB something something, and it knows to look in this folder. And again, I've not got a hash comment mark at the top, so use this. The Joypad auto config directory is opt retropie emulators retroarch configs. It will look in there for the files, and you can see it there because it's true. It will try to import this. So if you wanted a hard code buttons into this main file, it'd be worth setting that to false, I think, really. Otherwise it's having a bit of a conflict. It will import those files for the controller, and then it would also find elements in its own file, and I'm not sure which it knows should take precedence, so I'd use one or the other. Anyway, that's just saying that's where it's pulling that instruction in for. And because I added extra rows into that controller file, like the input enable hotkey button, then that will take effect in this main file. It doesn't have to exist in here because it's going to pull it in when it detects that Joypad. Or I could type it in here if I wanted and hardcode it. Okay, now we're going to have a look at the hotkey section. Again, Control W to search for text. And the text I'm going to look for is hotkey is bound, I think is the section. Okay, so you can see here we've got enable other hotkeys. If this hotkey is bound to either keyboard joy button or joy axis, all other hotkeys will be disabled unless this hotkey is also held at the same time. Now this down here, you can see it's uncommented and it's set to Alt, which was that second option we saw earlier in the config in the RetroPie setup script. So it said hotkeys are only working if you press Alt. Now the line we've put in the Joypad file says when I press a button of select, it's going to do it. So I don't, strictly speaking, need the input underscore enable underscore hotkey button, because this relates to the keyboard version of the hotkey button. But it does seem that with RetroArch, with what everyone's tried here, if you take this out, if you take a line out or blank this out for the hotkey keyboard, it means that the Joypad version doesn't work. So it does seem really important to make sure that you do have this line in your retroarch.cfg, that you do have a key that's mapped to enable hotkeys as well, if that's what you want. If I took that out and said an input enable hotkey was null, like that, then that would make all my hotkeys work, and it would conflict with the button that I've set in my Joypad. So if you want, and you probably will want a button to enable hotkeys, make sure you do map a key to it as well. You don't have to use it. So I don't have to use the Alt button to press it. It's just the line that exists there, and it knows that it's expecting a button to press before hotkeys work. And usually that would be my select button on the Joypad. I won't need to press Alt, but I'm going to keep this line in. Otherwise it means that the hotkey on my button just doesn't work correctly. So it's just worth noting that you should have that line in there. And that is how the hotkeys work in RetroArch. So you just make sure that they're mapped, that you've either enabled them, disabled them, or most likely only enable on demand, which is this value here, input enable hotkey. And you've seen how to put that in a joypad against a joypad button. Again, you could put that in this specific RetroArch file, but it's easier if you keep it in the gamepad file that's automatically imported. And I'll just have a look at some of the useful buttons. Again, I'm going to search in this file and search for reset. Okay, oh, ignore that. Control W to search again, press enter to search for the same text, reset again. I'm just going to do that a few times. There it is. Reset the content. So by default, input reset is set to H, and if I change this, or if I took the comment out so it'd use this line, put underscore btn, but I would put this in that joypad file we looked at earlier, not this file, because I want it specific to that joypad. Input reset button is maybe it's option 5, I don't remember what option 5 is, like that. Then if I held down select as the enable hotkey button, pressed maybe that's Y or something, 5, it would reset the game. So that's another example of a popular hotkey. Input reset is an option there. And you can do it with any of them. I mean, there's loads of hotkeys just listed here. You can scroll through them all and change any of the inputs. Screenshot, take a screenshot, or mute, unmute. There's pause in here, and you can do any of these. But remember, if you want to do it on your joypad, you finish these with underscore btn. And again, I wouldn't do it in this file. I'd put it in that joypad file that would be imported. Another option, if I just search again, Control W, for so let's save state. There we go. Save a game basically. So input save underscore state. If I put underscore btn equals, and I map that to whatever button 3 is, then I can save games by holding down select, because I've set that enable hotkey option, and press 3. It would do that. And like I say, you can do this to any of the hotkey buttons. The last one that is worth just listing here, you saw it earlier in the joypad file, but I'll just search for it again, is the exit emulator button. So just have a quick search for that. Here we go. So the keyboard version of this is escape, but in my joypad file I've got underscore btn equals, and I think I had mapped the start button to, I can't remember the number, but say it was 4. You just put that in your joypad file, and then you can exit the emulator. So that's a massively useful one with a joypad, to exit out of the game back to the menu system, so you can choose a new game. So you want to make sure that you set that. But again, I wouldn't do it in this CFG file. Make sure you do it in your joypad file, unless your joypad controllers are all set in this RetroArch CFG. Then you could put this line here as well. But it is useful to have the keyboard version as well. So I think mine was input exit emulator equal to escape, like that. So there's a keyboard version as well. And obviously the keyboard version doesn't have to just load with the joypad, so that's quite happily staying in this file. And that's pretty much all there is to it. I'll put relevant URLs in the description so you can see these sort of config files in a web browser. Any queries, put it in the comments and I'll try and get back to you. But really it's a case of having a clean retroarch.cfg file like this one. It's not too messy, it's pretty stock. You can see what's going on, and try to keep your joypad controls in the joypad auto config button to make it I think it's a bit cleaner and clearer to see that way. And you can see that that's how you can map controller hotkey buttons to your joypads. You can do that in multiple joypad files. So if you've got various different joypads you plug in, you can make sure that they're all mapped in a similar way, and that just makes jumping about using hotkeys, changing back to the EmulationStation menu a lot easier, quicker. No need for a keyboard, improves the portability. You just need your RetroPie powered HDMI cable in with a joypad. You don't need an Ethernet cable, you don't need Wi-Fi dongle, you don't need a keyboard plugged in. You can do all of the key actions through your joypad, and hopefully that'll help you understand how hotkeys work.